friends, foes, and side hoes, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Emma, and today we are going to be talking about the Amazon show UNDONE. It's a show by Kate Purdy and Raphael Bob-Waksberg of the wonderful and elusive BoJack Horseman. Today I'm going to talk about if you should watch it or not, depending on how you feel about it, how I feel about it, the things that you can take away from this video. Yeah, let's get started. First, I'm going to do a 60-second rundown of the show and its plot and its characters, so you have a little bit of sense of the show before we start getting into more heavy discussion. So let's set a timer. Oh my gosh. So UNDONE is about a girl named Alma who basically gets in a car crash, and when she gets in this car crash, she starts to see her father who died when she was 8. It's a little unclear, the timeline is very fucked up, but she starts to see her father and he basically tells her, "Hi, I've been murdered and I need you to go back in time with me and jump through all these hoops with me so you can figure out what's going on and who murdered me and maybe try and change it." He basically tells her that she comes from this long line of indigenous seers and shamans who are able to connect with an outer world. She goes through all these time jumps with her father, she starts to have these visions, but the people around her are very concerned about her and they start to think that she has schizophrenia. And so it discusses the line between what is considered in Western culture mental illness and what is considered to perhaps be a more, quote, enlightened or knowledgeable view of the universe and world. There are 25-minute episodes and there are 8 of them, so it's a fairly short show. Disclaimer, the show does talk about mental illness, it does talk a little bit about cultural appropriation and death, so watch with care. The first thing that I noticed, given how I have experienced life, is that she sort of throughout the show becomes very disillusioned with the romanticized idea of her father that she's had her entire life. And because her dad died so young, it's very, very easy to have this picturesque kind of view of a parent or a family member that perhaps died before you could get to know them a little better and get all the adult secrets, and perhaps become a little bit disillusioned with this perfect idea of your father or of your parent or of your loved one at a very young age. Because of that, she kind of has to grieve all over again, and it's really hard on her. It's really hard for her to trust this vision of her father that she has, or the father that she is working with at the time. It alludes to a little bit of a struggle within her that perhaps isn't as obvious on the screen, but is definitely something you can notice. It does also ask you to question what mental illness is, and this can be a really hard discussion for some viewers because especially if the viewer has a mental illness or has a loved one with a mental illness, it can perhaps give them an idea of it maybe tries to take away the stigma. I'm a little confused by the writers and creators' intentions with this, and I think a lot of it is just exploration and what it means and how we identify with things and how we define other people in our cultures. That being said, her father is Jewish, and a lot of the plotline is the fact that her father's mother, Geraldine, was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and her father believes that she might be one of these seers or these shamans that he believes that Alma is. This is a little bit alluding back to the fact that Alma becomes disillusioned with her father, because contradictory to that, her father becomes a little bit less disillusioned with this mother, because the mother that he knew as a child was very ill and very absent. He sort of, through his scientific discoveries, starts to romanticize the idea that maybe she wasn't mentally ill, maybe she had this gift of being a shaman. This show also feels a little bit like a superhero narrative. She starts from this very dull place in life, she doesn't really know where she's going, she's kind of the outcast black sheep of the family, and it's a little bit uncomfortable for her to just be in the state she's in. And then she has this accident, very superhero Marvel DC moment where she becomes a superhero that can help save her father. And the fact that in her more, I guess, grounded way of Western life is seen as a bad thing because she's labeled as schizophrenic, which, let me just say, certain mental illnesses should not be categorized as bad, but I think that's kind of the point, is that this family has this big stigma of mental illness, her sister's perfect, it's just a whole thing. Her mother just really wants her to succeed in a very specific form. That contrasts to the sort of more, I don't want to say romanticized idea of the shamanism that she could potentially have. It is kind of hard to accept that a little bit as a viewer, because when he starts to talk about the technicalities of it and how it goes into it, you're just kind of asked to accept it instead of sitting there trying to be okay, what does this mean? How does that work? And I don't know if that's a deliberate choice on the writer's behalf, or if that's just something that like perhaps wasn't explained as well as it was supposed to be, and viewers like were supposed to understand what was going on in terms of the very technical like theoretical physics aspect of it, because her father was a theoretical physicist exploring the ideas of shamanism and how biologically that perhaps could work, are the main part of the plot. Now in this, it's kind of interesting because her father keeps saying, I was murdered, I was murdered, I was murdered, I was murdered. And I'm not going to spoil it, this is a spoiler for your review. However, that's not the case, and you will come to learn that, I think, in episode 7. The show also explores a lot of existential questions as to how people deal with feeling. When Alma was having difficulty allowing her feelings to control her life and control where in time she would jump to, her father said, be like this guy, and sort of talks all about like how people should control their emotions. And he was saying like, let your emotions flow through you, they can't control you. And I don't know how I feel about that. I think that that's a question that's very much discovered, because Alma is really emotional and she doesn't really get rid of that. She learns how to control it a little bit, but like a lot of her mistakes don't come from her being emotional, they come from her sort of like trying to figure things out, as any human being would. And I think the be like the sky moment is very much indicative of her father's character, as in he was a very logical human being and trying to figure things out logically, as opposed to like almost like foil of Alma, who is extremely emotional, especially coming from this like life where she felt very dead after her accident. She sort of started to explore her emotions a lot more. And it's very interesting to see how the plot sort of varies for those two people, especially considering the ending. It also took a 1.5 years to make because it was rotoscoped. And let's talk about some visual aspects. So the visual aspects and the sort of production side aspects of the show are my favorite part. Guys, they're next level. So the whole show is rotoscoped. And if you don't know what rotoscoping is, it's okay. I don't really know what rotoscoping is either. It's very rarely used in TV because it's so hard. And it's a little bit more used in movies, but never for a whole movie, to my knowledge, except for perhaps like art films or indie films. If you have a movie that's fully rotoscoped or a TV show, please tell me because I would love to watch it. But that basically means that they shoot a lot of the scenes with actors, but the actors, especially in Undone, are not in a set. So they're in like a black box with markers. Artists and animators will go over the frames with animation and create backgrounds, so it takes a long time to film. Like this is an effort, again, as I said before, of a 1.5 years of work. And that is amazing to me. To me, rotoscoping is the perfect way to tell the story. It explores like universes and worlds that might be a lot harder to film, and it can create very emotional moments in like the art that perhaps maybe wouldn't translate in real life. Especially since the show is about an alternate experience of reality, I think it's really important almost to the storyline, because the rotoscoping becomes another character. It's the side of the world that Alma has to explore kind of on her own. She has a little bit of help from her partner, but that ends later in the show. No spoilers, but like, big yikes. It's really just so dynamic, and the show moves a lot in its rotoscoping and in its shot design with the rotoscoping. I don't know. They definitely added a lot of like almost character points to the rotoscoping and to the background and to the universe. And they use a lot of paintings. They had something like, I don't want to say the wrong number, but it was like thousands of paintings that they, like oil paintings that they commissioned people to make for these backgrounds. And a lot of it has to do with art and how art is portrayed and how art can be a part of a person's reality. It's just so cool. Like if you're gonna watch the show, if you feel comfortable watching the show, watch it for the rotoscoping alone. I'm not kidding.
Hi, Editing Emma, and I wanted to say that I completely forgot to mention that Alma is deaf, which is ridiculous. She wears a cochlear. It's ridiculous I forgot to mention it. She wears a cochlear, but whenever she takes it out, the sound goes. It's wonderful. We see Alma signing with her dad when she's really little. It's amazing and wonderful. And yeah, we love representation. It's great. And I can't believe I forgot to mention that. It also speaks more into the realm of like how we experience reality. So yeah, anyway, sorry.
I want to talk about the music. So there is no music, to my knowledge, that is not score. Score is composed music. I'm sure you know that, but felt a need to say it. And I think that that's really important. Keeps this world encapsulated in itself instead of pulling things from like outside influences that might give it like a time period or that sort of thing. And it's a little bit set in a time period, but it definitely remains timeless with a score, and the score matches it so beautifully. It's a little bit out there, but it's also super dramatic, and it's so dynamic, and it moves. It sounds almost like it was either composed to the rotoscoping, but more likely the rotoscoping was edited or designed in collaboration with the music. So it works really well together and definitely creates this sort of mindset that you can feel with Alma. And that's my favorite thing about the rotoscoping, is that you really get into her mind in ways that I don't think would translate really well, and I think the empathy perhaps wouldn't be there. It's just unbelievable. It's so cool. It's so cool. I love it. But yeah, I don't know. I think the music is beautiful, and it's also used very, very, very sparingly. Appreciation of silence is very important in the show, because a lot of this show is about sensory overload and feeling overwhelmed by the place you're in, and so the importance of silence and quiet spaces and stillness is extremely highlighted in this show. That being said, a lot of people are calling it trippy, which I don't really like. I think that is a little bit not exploitative, derivative from the stigma against schizophrenia and against other illnesses that have a more hallucinations, delusion aspect of diagnostic criteria. If you look at reviews for the show, literally every review that I have seen at least has used the word trippy. I think another way to define that word in the context of the show is it's kind of shaky because it was rotoscoped. So I would recommend, if you're gonna watch it and you get migraines, that you watch it on a big TV instead of having to kind of look really closely into a computer screen, because you'll really notice all the shakiness of it. And again, that could have been a choice, that could have not been a choice, but it can be a little dizzying at sometimes. And again, not a bad thing, just be mindful. Okay, so if we're gonna talk about mental illness, which I think is really important to the storyline, two mental illnesses that this touch upon are PTSD and potentially schizophrenia. It discusses schizophrenia, but there's no like, you have schizophrenia. It's just a lot of people who are not medical professionals telling her she does. I think that it really highlights what it means to have a mental illness in an age where so many people struggle with specific mental illnesses. While not all of them include hallucinations and delusions, a lot of them do include the sort of like very heavy feeling that Alma had about the world, and the way that people perceive reality can potentially be distorted, or perhaps they might feel deceived by their own reality. And it is really important to try and think about how different people experience reality, because we all do differently. I think this line between like a spiritual awakening and mental illness, I think there's a really fine line in the discussion and the show. I think that if you watch it, you are not gonna sit there and be like, oh yeah, she's schizophrenic, or oh yeah, she has this gift. I think that you're gonna watch it and be like, wow, I don't know. And that feels like it's the point. You're not supposed to walk away from the show with a finalized idea of what it is. It just opens up the definition of what it means to have a mental illness and what it means to have this label. And in some aspects, I think it almost removes some of the stigma from it. But because you get so deep into Alma's mind, it's really hard to label her as an individual, and you definitely have two competing narratives from two very different sources. But because you spend so much time in Alma's mind, that becomes what you see as a viewer, and so that becomes the thing that you accept as truth until it sort of all gets spun on its head as the show goes on. I don't like how mental illness is portrayed today. I really don't. And Raphael Bob-Waksberg and Kate Purdy have done such an incredible job with the nuances on BoJack Horseman that tackling an extremely stigmatized issue and discussion such as schizophrenia, I think that bringing that into a conversation in a very unbiased form can be very, very, very helpful. I also think that PTSD isn't really discussed as much, and how PTSD can cause or trigger other mental illnesses that might be genetic or that people might be predisposed to. That storyline gets a little bit lost, not for the worse, but just so you're aware. And I think that, I mean, she's put on medication to treat her PTSD, but that's about it, and she doesn't really talk about it that often. She definitely goes into the, I am a shaman, I understand, like, I'm gonna try so hard to save my dad because I love him and I would do anything to get him back. I also want to talk about grief. I think that grief is handled in a really positive way here, and I think that people forget that grief isn't technically a mental illness, but can cause a lot of other mental illnesses to maybe flare up or even sprout and grow or develop. And I think that the way grief is handled here is really true to the fact that a lot of children, when they lose parents, or a lot of people when they lose spouses, or even like parents losing children or that sort of thing, when it's somebody that you love unconditionally and without perhaps any ideas that they might have been a little bit more of a harmful human being than you remember, it's so much harder to criticize that person. And it's also difficult because when somebody dies, that's it. That's the narrative that you have of them. So it's difficult to hear other people's narratives of them if they maybe weren't that good of a human being, or maybe they did some harmful things. They're kind of like, no, I don't want to hear it. Please, please, please don't ruin my memory of them, because they're not here to defend themselves. And you can never get that romanticized image of them back. And sometimes it's so much easier to romanticize somebody who's gone because you want to love them and remember them as who they were to you. Maybe not who they were to the rest of the world, but they're not there to defend themselves. That's it for their narrative. To you, at least. I think a lot of what isn't addressed about PTSD is the fact that Alma can't really discuss what's happening to her to a therapist. They will definitely change or elaborate on her mental illness diagnosis, which I don't think she wants, because I think she wants to connect to her father in a way that she couldn't before. But in this process, she discovers that her father isn't who she thought he was, and it is so painful for her to have to keep learning and learning and learning all of these things about her dad she probably didn't want to learn. It's so hard to have an image of somebody you love just completely destroyed. And even in the narrative that we saw, when it's coming from him directly, that's painful. And of course, like when you grow up, you become cognizant of the fact that your parents aren't the wonderful people that you thought that they were. But when they die, it's so much harder, because you never ever want to think about that, especially if they die when you're really young. That is definitely something that is permeating through the entire show, no question. So that's something that's hard for you to watch. I would not watch this show, or I would make sure that you're watching it with somebody, or perhaps talking about it to somebody else after you watch it, because it is hard to watch. It is painful if that's something that you've experienced. I don't know. I obviously can't make the choice for you about whether or not you should watch the show. Artistically, it is so beautiful. It is so gorgeous, and it takes such a different take on the way that we portray mental illness and that sort of thing, that if you are interested in that sort of thing, I would definitely watch it, but also watch it with caution, because it does tackle a lot of topics, as I said before. If you think that the indigenous culture representation could be bad for you, again, it's your choice, but it's an interesting critique that I don't think a lot of people have talked about. And again, I'm not indigenous. This is not really my place to say that this is cultural appropriation, but it is definitely something to think about and discuss, because even though Alma was indigenous, her father's exploration into her apparent shamanism came from her father's mother, who was not explicitly described as an indigenous person, just as a Jewish, and specifically a white Jewish person. Because he tells Alma that her shamanism comes from her indigenous culture that is on her mother's side. I don't particularly know how that works in terms of the plot. Yeah, I don't know. I really love it. I'm not gonna lie, this is kind of a biased review because I really love the show, and it made me think about a lot of things I didn't want to think about. That's to me what good television makes me do. It makes me think about things that maybe I don't want to think about in my real life, or I don't want to address in my real life, and it forces me to feel the things that maybe I don't want to feel. And yeah, that can suck and be hard and maybe trigger something for you. So again, watch with caution. I'm not saying that causing deep emotional pain and feeling your emotions in this kind of very complex way is good for people. It can be really hard. Don't get me wrong. I definitely wanted to tell you guys about the highs and lows of the show, because they are so drastically different from anything else I've ever watched on television. So yeah, if you have watched the show and enjoy the show, or don't enjoy the show, or have some commentary about what's addressed, please leave a comment. I am very desperate to talk about the show with somebody. Nobody in my life has watched it that I know of, and I'm really desperate to talk about it. I'm not gonna lie. So there's a lot to discuss, and I think it needs to be discussed, not just absorbed. I think that they can definitely go hand in hand. Don't get me wrong, but I definitely think that this show needs to be discussed. So I would love if you could leave a comment. If you also want to like the video and subscribe, please do. I would appreciate that. But if not, that's okay. And I appreciate you for even watching this far. Also, you can follow my socials, which will be linked in the description below. I also stream on Twitch, and my Sims 4 stuff is on the gallery. Both are under itsemmaduke, and which is the name of also almost all my socials except for Instagram, because I got emma.png and nobody can stop me. Thanks 2012, we appreciate you. Thank you so much for watching. I love you all. Be good to yourselves, be good to others, and be good to the world. Please fucking strike for climate change. We hate to see it. I love you all, and have a beautiful and wonderful day.